I will not say who I am. I will not say what position I held at that allowed me to be aware of the information I'm about to share. Suffice to say, I don't hold it anymore. I have read some of the letters directed at Seth and Fox complaining about Season 8 of Family Guy, and while I can't officially make these statements to any press, I don't want to stay quiet anymore. Many people feel that Season 8 was just off in an odd sort of way. For anyone who took note of Season 8 of Family Guy and for the specific reason of elevated graphic violence, I just wanted to say this. Seth MacFarlane was going through a lot during the times of these episodes were written and produced. He was heavily involved in writing the episodes alongside the series writers, several of which made comments later regarding his apparent state of mind during writing sessions. However, more recently, when looking for his corroborators, my ex-coworkers denied Seth being involved as well as Steve, whom I'll explain in a bit. A number of scenes did generate a certain amount of negative viewer response. Peter's head getting crushed in between two logs, for instance. But I'd like to point out that these images were no more graphic than the things you might see than on other adult cartoons. In addition, there have been blood and gore in the series before. Typically, it's just more spread out over the season. However, if you did feel such imagery was out of place for the series, you were right. Editors cut nearly 2 hours of animated gore, violence, sexual abuse from Season 8, as well as rejected those proposed episodes featuring the character Quagmire stalking, capturing, raping, and finally killing a woman whom he kept for several days alive in his basement. Stewie developing a mind control ray, which he tests on Brian, but though he eventually uses it to have relations with him. Lois becoming pregnant after cheating on Peter in a threesome with friends from college. Confesses to him, and after they argue about what to do about the pregnancy, he performs home abortion on her using a coat hanger. The last episode was eventually rethought and made as partial terms of endearment, but was cut from the air from the US, despite being shown in the UK and being available on DVD for this season. I would like to point out that the episode Doggone, in which Brian loses faith in the ability to write and accidentally hits and kills a dog with his car while drunk by crushing it in half. When he reveals this, everyone but Stewie laughs at him and mocks him, saying that no one cares. Stewie does mock him for a while, but he realizes how serious Brian is about this issue. He stages Brian's death so that Brian can see the family mourn and feel validated. I suggest you to watch this episode while keeping in mind that Seth often represents himself through Brian and Stewie. In this particular episode, I also believe the various dogs and their reaction to their environment reflect Seth's emotions. Early on, when I asked Seth about why he seemed to be empathizing with the use of Brian and Stewie, he just told me that he was frustrated with the series so far, that he'd begin to feel like the earlier seasons were idiotic, that the fan base were morons, and that he was stuck. His name would always be associated with Family Guy. He also told me that he was bringing in someone to help mature the material. He mentioned having worked briefly with some man before. The stressed, slightly manic tone of Season 8 accumulates in Brian and Stewie, one of the most serious episodes in this entire series. There are no cutaways, and the titular characters behave in the way it seems to show them in their most distilled forms. Again, the episode was heavily censored and altered. The original script called for the season in which Brian eats Stewie's stool to be shown, not implied. Brian considers suicide because he feels his life has no purpose, and Stewie saves him with their friendship. Following this episode, the tone evens out, and things return to more or less normal for the series. There was nothing particularly occult or metaphysical regarding the circumstances around the making of the Season 8. None of the writers or animators went insane. There were no mysterious deaths or positions. None of that. For those who are looking for a twist or reason, I will say this. While Seth usually seems tired of working, he did his best to keep up his appearances at major events and gatherings. However, it was said that he often looked sicker or more listless in the presence of his consultant. I assume this was the man Seth had mentioned earlier on, and was reluctant to say no suggestions, said consultant, whom I will call Steve, made. From what I've gathered, he didn't really start making suggestions during sessions until around episode 3, but was talking to Seth in private about the series. He was silent for most of the time, for some time, almost absent aside from just sitting in, and then began to converse and more actively with Seth and the co-writers by the middle of the season. While those who had to deal with Steve did usually seem irritated or perturbed by his presence, he did have some connections. Dwayne Johnson's brief appearance in episode 10, Big Man on Hippocampus, was attributed to Steve, and I was told Mr. Johnson when jokingly asked by one of the crew members on the set on how he got asked to do the scene, commented that he was only there because he owns a favorite Steve. He acted uncomfortable at the time, and even during filming the short, it was done in one take and was not asked to do a second time. From what I've heard, Steve was present and seemed pleased by the fact that Mr. Johnson was visibly uneasy. During one session, the second time I saw him in person, I did question Steve directly about a suggested plot, and when he turned to look at me, I was genuinely scared. I had no idea why. He had never once threatened, swore, or made a personally violent move. I suppose it was the series of ideas regarding violence and gore he pitched to Seth. I should mention that when others did protest suggested violence, Steve would typically switch to sexual themes, racism, mental illness, or just withdraw altogether until he could work on one of those themes again. The pitch I was concerned about was for a running gag. The question I asked for someone was along with the lines of, I think what we're doing may be too much for one episode. April and Quahog. Blood is okay once, maybe twice in the episode, but showing it the same man dying and over might be a bit too much. The gag being pitched was that Peter, at various points in the episode, runs over the same man, who was desperate, being whole and alive every encountered, and increasingly mauled every instance with a different recurring character and screaming that the man was dead. Seth was unaccompanied to the writing sessions for episode 17, and that he was more energetic than I've seen him in months. He was almost celebratory, and it shows. He picked some of his favorite musical numbers from the series, Cut or Not. For the end of the episode, the plot of the witch seemed to be the symbol for his own self-redemption. I've been unable to track Steve down since to find out about more about him. No records exist within the company to show that he was ever officially signed or paid. I believe he might be privately hired by Seth. For what reason, I have no idea. I'm just glad to know he's gone. Well, this was an interesting story, and very believable if Steve even existed. Like, what if Seth began to hate the earlier Family Guy seasons? Because this reminds me of what I think that Matt Stone and Trey Parker hated the earlier seasons of South Park. If you don't know, Family Guy had gotten darker over times. Now, what do I think of this creepypasta? I think it's pretty interesting to say the least. It was kind of believable if Seth actually hated the earlier seasons, and like I said, is probably the reason why this show went darker all of a sudden. Now, my problem with the story is the fact that this wasn't necessarily a creepypasta, The reason why I used the term earlier is because it's on the Creepypasta wiki. It felt more like some sort of rumor or lore, and it certainly did not fit the lost episode category when it comes to creepypastas. And sure, it did have a few confusing moments, like is Seth the one behind this, or is Steve the one behind this? Because I literally see two people in this story that has given ideas on to make the show more darker and within the later seasons. Because isn't the person who made the show, like, the person who's the boss behind this? Like, I think he might be the boss with the person, and that would be Seth MacFarlane. What else? Anyway, I won't go further into detail on that. But anyway, I did find this story somewhat interesting, and if you agree or disagree with that, that is fine. I can respect your own opinion on the story. My final rating on the story or lore is a 8 out of 10. This wasn't necessarily an actual lost episode creepypasta, but more of a theory, and this theory is something I actually can believe in. Anyway, I'm out.